We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Gimel Amud Aleph Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 93a. The Mishnah said that if the blood of a carbon chatos gets on a beged, so then that beged requires washing. And the Mishnah also said that if it's dam puzzle, if it's disqualified blood, so then there is no such requirement of washing the garment. And the Gemara now says, Boi minei Rami bar Chama me Rav Chisda. Rami bar Chama asked Rav Chisda the following question: Nitaz al beged tameh. Let's say the blood from the carbon chatas, it gets on a beged, but the beged itself is tameh, and so the blood is becoming tameh, essentially disqualified the moment that it touches the beged. Mahu, what would be the halacha in such a situation? Rashi explains, Nitaz al beged tameh v'nitma b'nigiyaso. The blood becomes tameh when it touches the beged. B'nigiyaso bo, when it touches that beged. Mihavi dam pasol ki ilu nitma kodem lachein. Is it considered to be disqualified blood as if it was already previously tameh? In which case, v'lo boy chibus. In which case, this garment does not require laundering. It doesn't require to be washed. O dilmar, maybe kevan devidna denafal aleh. Since at the moment it fell on it, akati kosher have, it's still kosher blood. They have a psul dam utiinas kibus lebeged boin keechad, and then the disqualification of the blood and the requirement to wash the garment come at the same time. Kidem efarish v'yazallah Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua, like Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua will explain. So that is the question. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua. Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua says, Midukami boy lehachi. From the very fact that Rami bar Chama is asking this question, Shma'amina, we see Haisalah Shas HaKosher v'nifsalah. Let's say there was a moment where the blood was kosher and then it became disqualified. Apparently, Ein Dama Ton Kibus. In that case, it must be that if that kind of blood touches the beged, that kibus is not required. Washing the garment is not required. In other words, if the blood had a moment of hechsher but then became disqualified, that's disqualified blood, and there's no requirement. And hani mili bazeh charzeh, and that's true only if it happens bazeh charzeh, meaning if it becomes disqualified and then it gets on the beged, so then the kibus is not required. Avol bebasachas lo, but then we might say that if it all happens at once, like Rashi just said, then we would not say that, and we would say in such a situation kibus would be required in that case. Odil maloshna, or maybe there is no difference. It doesn't matter if it's bazeh charzeh or bevasachas. That essentially is the question of Rami bar Chama. In other words, what's being explained in the Gemara now, what Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua is saying, is that according to Rami bar Chama, most certainly if the blood is disqualified before it touches the beged, that's not even a question. That seems to be obvious that in such a situation, you don't need to wash the beged. The entire question is, if the blood becomes disqualified the moment that it touches the beged, that's a question whether or not kibus is required. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei, he said back to him, Rav Chisda responded, Plugsa de Rebbe Lozer v'Rabbanon aliba de Rabba. This issue is actually a machlokus between Rebbe Lozer and the Rabbanon, according to Rabba's explanation. Uchedekamitzaretz Abaye, and as Abaye answered, as the Gemara will now explain. Rashi explains with the commentaries Abaye lemilse de Rabba. Abaye is going to explain or answer what Rabba says. The parish plugsayu to Rebbe Lozer Rabbanon, who explains the machlokus between Rebbe Lozer and the Rabbanon. And the Gemara now continues and brings first the machlokus Rebbe Lozer and the Rabbanon. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rebbe Lozer Omer, Rebbe Lozer says, mechatos shenitmu. If you have the mechatos, those are the waters of purification that are used for tomas meis. If that mechatos, if those mechatos become tamei, mitarin, so even though they become tamei, they are still able to purify. They're still able to be effective in terms of purification from tomas meis. And how do we know that? Shaharei nida meizin aleh, because when it comes to a nida, one can sprinkle the mechatas upon her, and even though the mechatas are becoming tamei from the nida, but apparently they're still effective in purification. That's what Rebbe Lozer says. And Rashi explains, Mitarin esa adam mitumas meis. You're using these mechatas to purify a person who has tumas meis. Ki'ilu lo nitma, as if he had not become tamei. And what's the proof? Rebbe Lozer says, Shaharei nida, because a nida shenitma b'meis. Let's say you have a nida who's also, she's tamei meis. Meizin oleh lifnei tvilas nida. So one can sprinkle the mechatas on her before she immerses to purify herself from her tumas nida. V'toveles l'shtei hatumas b'tvilachas, and she can then immerse and actually purify herself from both tumas with one immersion. Shalom matzinu b'torah shehuzkuka litvo l'nidasa tchila, because the point point is, we don't find in the Torah that the Torah says she has to immerse first to purify herself from her nida, and then again she will receive the sprinkling of the mechatas in order to purify herself when she immerses. And therefore, since we don't find that, you can have a raya from here for a case, let's say the mechatas became tamei before they were used over here. In this case, it's becoming tamei as it is going upon the nida, but we can bring a proof from here in a situation where the mechatas became tamei before they were sprinkled, and again, they're going to be effective in terms of purification according to Rebbe Lazar. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rabba, and Rabba says, in explaining Rebbe Lazar, that Rebbe Lazar b'shitas Rebbe Akiva Rabbo Amar, Rebbe Lazar is following the opinion of Rebbe Akiva, who was his Rebbe. Do Amar havoras kli al gabe makom tamei, because Rebbe Akiva says that if a vessel passes over an area that's tamei, kemunach dami, it's as if it is at rest, and therefore it's possible that it's going to become tamei in such a situation. Rashi explains, V'yamar Rabba, and Rabba says, Rebbe Lazar shemevi raya mehazoas nida, Rebbe Lazar who's bringing a proof from the sprinkling of a nida with the mechatas, she'eno domelazu. The point over here is that's not a perfect analogy. It's not exactly similar. De'ilu nida hazov v'tomas hamayim boin ke'echad, because by nida, as we said, the sprinkling of the mechatas on the nida and that water becoming tummy is happening at the same time. Ve'enzu rayo lidnitmu kodem hazoya. That doesn't seem to be a proof to a case where they become tamei before the hazah, before the sprinkling. Ela sha'amra b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbo. But again, he's going according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe, that says again, havoras kli agabi makom tami is kamunach dami. And Rashi explains, do Amar, Rabbi Akiva says, kol ha-tumas metamin mechatas ha'oven al aviro. Anytime you have tumah and you have mechatas going over the airspace of that tumah, the mechatas will be tamei. Hilkach nitmu hamayim misha'avru al avir hanida. And so therefore, the point is, the mechatas over here, the water, the moment it goes over the airspace of the nida, they become tamei. V'hazah lo havoy ad shenagu hamayim bev'sara. But the sprinkling doesn't actually happen until the water actually touches her flesh, and that essentially is why Rebbe Lazar is able to bring the proof. That's what Rabba is explaining within Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar holds, like Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe, that in the airspace of the nida already, we say that the mechatas become tamei, and therefore the tumah precedes the sprinkling, because the water only touches the nida after, and that's why Rebbe Lazar is able to bring his proof from nida. And the Gemara continues, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah in Meseches Para, haya omed chutz l'tanor. Let's say a person is standing outside of the oven. What that means is he's standing and the oven is between himself and the window. V'sheretz b'tanor, there is a sheretz that's tumah, that is in the tanor. A sheretz is a creepy, crawling creature which is tamei, that is in the tanor, it's in the oven. V'hoshet yado l'chalon, and he stretches his hand out to the window. Again, the oven is between himself and the window. V'notal es halogin, and he takes the login, which is the container of the mechatos, the jug of the mechatos, the heviro al pi tanor, and then he brings it over the airspace of the tanur. This is a case of airspace. Rabbi Akiva mitame v'chachamim mitar. Rabbi Akiva says tame in that case, and the chachamim say tahar. Uvaha pligi, and they're arguing exactly about the issue we just said above. To Rabbi Akiva savar kimunach dami. Rabbi Akiva holds it as if it's at rest in the oven, and that's why it becomes tame. For Rabbanan savri lav kimunach dami. The Rabbanan say it's not like it's at rest, and therefore it is tahar. And Rashi explains, V'notal es halogin, he takes the jug, shel mechatos, of the mechatos, uv Meseches para taninan line. This is a Mishnah Meseches para, as we said. And Rashi says, umalo hi la mechatos. This is a malo, meaning to say it is a stringency by mechatos, that we would say that it's tamei in such a situation. Now, the commentaries do discuss whether Rashi means here it's a maila on a d'rabbanan level, or is this even on a doraisa level. There are some difficulties if one says it's just a d'rabbanan level, because the Gemara here in general is talking about a doraisa issue, but in any case, that is something that is discussed by the commentaries. And the Gemara continues, V'esve Abaye, and Abaye asks on this explanation of Rabbah that there's a Tosefta that says the following. It says, Moder Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva would admit, Bahazah, let's say the person is actually sprinkling the mechatos, and Shavira al klicheres tamei, let's say in the act of sprinkling it goes over the airspace of a klicheres, of an earthenware vessel that's tamei, or al gabe mishkav umoshav tamei, or on top of something which is used for lying upon or sitting upon, which is tamei. In those cases, Rabbi Akiva says, shehi tahora, that it's going to be pure. Just because it's in the airspace does not make it tamei. She'ein loch davar shemitami lemala kilamata. We don't find any time that airspace becomes tamei when it's above. Ela kazayis min hames, except for a kazayis min hames, the airspace above that is tamei. Ushar kol hamahilin, and other items which again have what's called tumas oel, leisuye even hamenugas, and that would include even hamenugas, which is a stone marked with leprosy. And so therefore you see from this Tosefta that Rabbi Akiva does not agree with the concept of the airspace imparting tumah. And so Abaya offers another explanation. Elo Amar Abaya, rather Abaya says, Tekuli alma lav kemunach dami. Really everybody agrees that it is not kemunach, it's not as if it is at rest. V'hacha b'haka miflagi. And here the actual machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon, again in the case where it's being passed over the tanur, is the Rabbi Akiva savar gazrinon shema yanuach. Rabbi Akiva holds that there's a gezerah, we're afraid maybe it will come to rest. Rabbanon savri lo gazrinon, and the Rabbanon hold we don't make such a gezerah. Umod Rabbi Akiva behazah, and in that case Rabbi Akiva admits in a case where the person is sprinkling it, it's not simply being passed over the airspace in his hand, but he's sprinkling it. So there Rabbi Akiva admits kevan de nafak, once it leaves his hand, it leaves his hand, and we don't say a gezerah shema yanuach in such a situation. And Rashi explains, Moda Rabbi Akiva admits, Afal Pisha Nechlak Bilogin Shal Mechatos, even though he argues in the case where there's the jug of Mechatos, Moda Hu Bahazah, he admits, when the Mechatos is sprinkled, Shavir, and again it goes over Tumah, Shayamaza Al Ha'odam V'tanur Tamei Mafsiko, he's, let's say, sprinkling it on the person, and then there's a Tamei Tanur that is in between, V'avra Hazal Piatanur, and that Hazah, that sprinkling goes over the mouth of the oven, Lemala Kilamata Ba'ohel Kivinagia, Kilamata means again essentially Tumas Ohel. And Rashi continues, Hachi Garsinon, this is the proper text, Ushar Kol HaMahilim, the other cases of Tumas Ohel, Loisuye Even HaMenugas, to include the Even HaMenugas, the stone marked with leprosy. Alma, in any case we see, Bahazoas Nida Lekol Meimer Rabbi Akiva, in the case of sprinkling on the Nida, when the Mechatas are sprinkled on the Nida, Rabbi Akiva would not say, Mishabol Lemala Bi'aver Al HaNida Nitzmes, that from the moment that it goes over the airspace of the Nida would be Tameh. That would not be the case. Again, Rabbi Akiva admits in a situation where it's already been sprinkled, there we say that it's not going to be Tameh, and so we cannot have Rabba's explanation within Rebbe Lazar. You can't say that Rebbe Lazar holds like Rabbi Akiva, and therefore again it becomes Tameh before it actually touches the Nida. That's why that is a proof to cases where the Mechatas became Tameh. That cannot be the explanation of Rebbe Lazar. And Rashi continues, Elam or Abaya, rather Abaya says, the Kuli Alma Filo b'Mechatos Lav Kemunach Dami. Again, everybody agrees, even by Mechatos, that it's not Kemunach. Elo le'inyan login hu degaz Rabbi Akiva. As the Gemara said, it's only by the case of the jug that Rabbi Akiva makes a gezerah. That's a gezerah shema yanichena besocha avir derech avarasa. We're afraid he's going to place it within the airspace while he's passing it over. Aval bahazaba, by sprinkling she'eno mavir, where he's not passing it over and holding onto it. Elazorka, but he throws it. Modahu datar. Again, in that case, he would admit that it is pure. Dekevan de nafak miyadu. Once it leaves his hand, nafak legamri, it leaves completely. Vein biyadu or it wouldn't even be possible for him to put it into the actual tanur. And the Gemara continues, according to this, Rabbi Lazar v'Rabbanan b'maika miflagi. So Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanan, what are they arguing about? And Rashi explains, Rabbi Lazar d'maisi raya l'milse mehazoas nida. Again, Rabbi Lazar is bringing a proof from the sprinkling of the nida. He's saying, since when one sprinkles the nida with mechatas, she is pure. Therefore, that shows that even tamei mechatas can purify. V'Rabbanan da'amri eino raya. The Rabbanan say you can't bring a proof from nida. What's going on over there? And the Gemara continues and explains, Zamar Abaya says, Bidonin Tuma Keduma Mituma Shaba'osa Shah Kamiflagi. They're arguing whether we can learn Tuma Keduma, that means Tuma that happens earlier, from a case of Tuma that happens at that moment. That's the whole argument. Mar Savar Donin, Umar Savar Ein Donin. One holds we could learn, that would be Rebbe Lazar, and the other opinion says we cannot learn, that would be the opinion of the Rabbanan. Rashi explains, Bidonin Tuma Keduma Kagon Mechata Shenitmu Lifnei Hazas, and we're trying to learn to a case where the mechatas become tummy before being sprinkled, and we're learning mituma shaba'osasha from a case where it was tummy at the same moment. Kagon hazoas nida, like the case of sprinkling the nida with the mechatas. Shatumas hamayim v'hazoa boin ke'echad. There, the water becomes tummy at the same moment as the sprinkling, and that's kamiflagi. That's the machlokus. Rabbi Lazar savar donin v'Rabbanan savri ein donin. Rabbi Rabbi Elazar says we can learn. The Rabbanan say we cannot. Now, ulagabe nitas dam chatas al beged tamei. Now, going back to our original question, let's say you have a case where the dam chatas is sprinkled on a garment that's tamei. The boy lon lael nami. We had that question earlier because again, in that case, the blood does not become disqualified until the moment it touches the beged. So that's going to be the same machlokas plugs of the Rabbi Elazar for Rabbanan. That's going to be the same machlokas Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanan according to the way that Abaye just explained it. To Rabbi Elazar ein ton kibus. According to Rabbi Elazar, the garment will not need to be washed. To tumah shebeshas nefila ketumah shelifnei nefila, because the tumah that happens at the moment it falls on the garment is the same as if it happened before. Well, the Rabbanan lo damo hadadi, and according to the Rabbanan, you're not able to compare the two cases. Now, why is it that the Gemara phrases this as according to Rabba with Abaye's answer? The Gemara should simply say we're following Abaye. And the reason is because Rabba is only because Abaye is his student and he's not arguing. Rather, he was learning this in front of him. And he explained this way to him, and then he admitted to him. That's why it's phrased as Abaye, again, in front of Rabba or according to Rabba. And the Gemara continues with another approach to the machlokas between Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanan. Rava says, the Kuli Alma ain't done, and really everybody agrees we do not learn Tumah Keduma, an earlier Tumah, from Tumah Ba'os Hashah, Tumah that happens at that moment. V'hacha b'haka miflagi. And here the machlokas between Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanan is as follows. The Rabbi Elazar holds, Hazah tzricha shir, that the sprinkling of the mechatos, there's a minimum amount that needs to be sprinkled, umitzdarfin lahazos, and then you combine the various sprinklings. And what that means is that when the nida is sprinkled with the mechatos, it's not immediately a hazah that purifies her. It actually only becomes hazah when the various sprinklings of water combine together for the proper shear. And so therefore it actually is a case in the situation of nida where the tumah does precede the hazah, because the moment that the water touches the nida, it is tameh. But it's not actually a hazah until you have the minimum shear. And so therefore it is actually a case of tumah keduma. You don't have to learn tumah keduma from tumah shaba'os hashah according to Rabbi Elazar. For Rabbanan Savri, the Rabbanan hold hazah ein tzricha shear. There is no minimum requisite amount when it comes to the sprinkling of the mechatos, and so therefore it is happening at the same time, and you cannot learn to a case where the tumah happens earlier. And Rashi explains the Kuli Alma ain't done, and again everybody agrees we do not learn a case of Tumah Keduma from the case of Tumah Shabos Hashah. Rabbi Elazar Tumah Keduma mi Tumah Keduma Yolef. Rabbi Elazar is really learning Tumah Keduma from Tumah Keduma. He's learning a case where the Mechatos becomes Tamei earlier, from the case of Nida where it also is becoming Tamei earlier. The Rabbi Elazar Savar Hazah Tzricha Shir, because Rabbi Elazar holds there's a minimum amount needed for Hazah. Umitzdarfin lahazos, and you combine the sprinklings of the water. V'chin nafla Hazah kamaisa Allah, and when that first amount of water falls on her, akati lav Hazah hilatara, that's still not called the Hazah for purification purposes to purify her. V'afagav shenitmis Hazah harishona kashenagaba, and even though that Hazah, that first Hazah becomes tummy the moment it touches her, chozeres umitzdarefes umashnia, but then it still combines with the next drop, lahashlam hashir, in order to complete the requisite amount. Alma mechatos shenitmu lifnei Hazah mitarin, and so you see from the case of Nida that mechatos to become tummy before Hazah do in fact purify. And Rashi continues, Rabbanan Savri ein Hazah tzarich shira. The Rabbanan hold there is no minimum amount. Ume Hazah kamaisa istalko lo Hazah. Therefore, from the first moment of the Hazah, that's a Hazah. V'leka l'meilaf mina tumah keduma. You can't learn from that case to a case where the tumah happens earlier. The hach l'gabi nida tumah shava'os hashahi, because the case of nida is a tumah that's happening at that exact moment. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Chatos psula v'chulu. Let's say a chatos is disqualified, so then its blood gets on a garment. That garment does not need to be washed. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, midama, it says from its blood. And we learn from there, midam ksheira v'lo midam psul. It has to be the blood that is kosher, and not from blood that is disqualified. And the Brisa now brings the Machlokas Tanoim exactly what that means or what the parameters are. Rabbi Akiva says, Haisalah shas hakosher v'nifsalah. Let's say there was one point in time where the blood was kosher for Zerika, and then it becomes disqualified. So then damaton kibus. Then actually the blood does require, if it gets on a garment, that the garment be washed. It just has to have a moment where it was kosher for Zerika. But lo Haisalah shas hakosher, if it was never kosher, there was no moment where it was kosher for Zerika, v'nifsan, it was disqualified, ein damaton kibus. Then the blood gets on the garment. There's no requirement of washing that garment. This is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. We mentioned this earlier. For Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon says it doesn't matter when it became disqualified. Echad zeh v'echad zeh, both in a situation where it had a shas hakosher and a situation where it did not. Ein damaton kibus. The blood does not require laundering. Again, if it's disqualified blood that gets on the garment. And the Gemara continues, my time with Rabbi Shimon. What's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Because ksiv osa uchsiv midama. It says the word osa and it says midama, and we learn from both words. Chad lahecha dahaisala shasa kosher. One of those words comes to say that even in a situation where it was kosher at one point in time, but the fact is it's disqualified, and since it's disqualified, there's no requirement again for the washing of the garments. We'll take a look at the psukim. The pasuk says, Vayikra vav chaf, it says, Kol asher yiga b'v'sari yikdosh v'asher yiza midama al habeged. Anything that gets from the blood on the beged, asher yiza olet techabes b'makom kadosh, that has to be washed. And then the pasuk goes on to say, Kol zocher b'kohanim yochal osa kodesh kadoshim hi. And so again, learning from both of these psukim, it says osa, it says midama. It even applies where it's the shas kosher. And the Gemara continues with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva uses osa for something else. Osa prat letruma. Osa comes to exclude truma. Again, the halach is that if kodesh is cooked in a vessel, so then that vessel needs merika and shtifa, it needs to be scoured and rinsed, but that does not apply if truma was cooked in the vessel, and that's learned from osa. Now, Rabbi Shimon, how does he know to exclude truma? For Rabbi Shimon l'taimi, Rabbi Shimon follows his reasoning. Diamar kachim kalim ein tu'un in meriko shtifa. He says even kachim, if it's the lesser kind of kachim of lesser holiness, even that does not require merika and shtifa. The kol shekain truma. So then it's obvious. Certainly, truma will not require marika and shtifa, and a pasuk is not needed for that. And Rashi explains, midama, the pasuk says midama, miyutahi, that's an exclusion. It means dama shel zu, v'lo dama shel acheres, this kind of blood, but not that kind of blood. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon, pligi, b'hai psula, demiat kra, v'lefrushe kasu. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon are arguing, okay, so we understand that if it's disqualified blood, that is excluded there, the clothing don't need to be washed in that case, but what exactly does that mean? Does it mean any kind of disqualified blood, or is it only disqualified blood where there was no shas kosher? Again, that's a machlokas Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon. Then the Gemara said ksiv osa. It says the word osa. Basarei dekra dekibus umrika ushtifa. That's right after the pasuk that mentions the scouring and the rinsing. Ksiv kol zachar b'kohanim yochal osa. It says this word osa. Osa prat letruma, and we can say that osa excludes truma. Va'amrika ushtifa koy. According to that, it goes on scouring and rinsing, as we said. Kedamrina lekaman b'pirkin, like we're going to say later on in the parak. Rabbi Shimon l'taime lekaman b'masnis. And Rabbi Shimon, he follows his reasoning. That's later on in the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Nitas min hatzavar al habeged. Let's say the blood goes directly from the neck of the animal onto the garment. Eino ton kibus. In that case, there's no requirement of washing the garment. Min hakeren, let's say it goes from the corner of the mizbeach onto the beged. Umin hayasod, or from the base of the mizbeach onto the beged. Also in those cases, eino ton kibus, no washing is needed. Nishbach al haritzpa, let's say the blood spills on the floor. Vasaf, when it gets gathered up. Ein ton kibus, in that case also, if the blood gets on a garment, kibus is not needed. Ein ton kibus ella dam sheneskavel bekli v'roy lahazah. The requirement of kibus is only if the blood was received in a vessel and it is fit for hazah, fit for sprinkling. And Rashi explains, Nitas min hatzavar al habeged kidem mefarish time of a Gemara. Let's say it sprays from the neck of the animal onto the garment. The Gemara will explain that. And min hakeren shel mizbeach, if it goes from the corner of the mizbeach, min hayesod shel shirayim, or let's say it's from the remainder blood that's by the base of the mizbeach. Uve perak beis Shammai, in perak beis Shammai earlier, targimna to min hakeren mamish. When we say it goes from the corner of the mizbeach to the beged, that's directly from the corner to the beged. Umin hayesod, and when we say it goes from the base of the mizbeach, it doesn't really mean from the base. It means min haroy liyasod, once it is fit to be poured to the base. Meaning, the mishanit and matan dama, once the blood is applied, ein shirayim to unin kibus. The shirayim, the remainder blood, if they get on a garment, there's no requirement of kibus. Hachi garsinan v'taimim mefarish b'gemara. The reason for this will be explained in the Gemara. Hachi garsinan b'masnisan. Rashi says the proper text in the Mishnah is nishbach al haritzba v'asafu ein ton kibus. If it spills on the floor and it's gathered up, there's no kibus requirement. Ve'ein ton kibus ela hadam sheneskavel b'kli. Only if it's received in a vessel is there a requirement of kibus. Over Gemara parach hasul lamali, the Gemara will ask why we need to say anything further in the Mishnah over here. And nishbach ala ritzba mitzavar behema, the last case, if it spills, it pours onto the floor from the neck of the animal, and again it is gathered up, so there's no requirement of kibus. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Yochol nitas min hatzavra al habeged. One might think that if the blood went directly from the neck onto the garment, yeheton kibus, that there would be a requirement of washing the garment. Talmud lomer asher yazeh, the pasuk says asher yazeh, lo amarti loch ela baroi lahazah. It has to be fit for hazah, that's for sprinkling application to the mizbeach. Rashi says baroi lahazah means sheneskavel b'kli, it has to have been received in a vessel. And the Gemara continues, Tanya idach, we learned in another brayso, Yochol nitas min hakeren min hayisod, yeheton kibus. One might think if it sprays from the corner or the base of the mizbeach onto the garment, that kibus is required. Talmud lomer asher yazeh, it says that it's to be sprinkled prat lezeh shekvar huzah, that excludes this case where it was already sprinkled on the mizbeach, it was already applied. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said nishbach ala ritzba, if it pours onto the floor, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis.